Welcome to the Friday edition of the 14 podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Special guest today, Chase Parham, one of my good friends in the business. I've known Chase for a long time. He is an editor at RebelGrove.com. They are the best in the business at covering Ole Miss. They're part of the Rivals Network. Chase, thanks for joining us today on what I know is a really busy time for you. Just the hype around this Ole Miss-Alabama game is just crazy at this point, and I think it's justifiably so.
Yeah, Chris, good to be with you. It's one of those interesting things because Ole Miss just trying to kind of have a resurgence back into somewhat of a conference conversation, national conversation that has been dormant since the NCAA penalties came down 5 years ago or 4 years ago, since Hugh Freeze, frankly, beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa the last time, which was in 2015. It sort of spiraled from there downward. Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss trying to raise it back up. So you would have a lot of intrigue anyway, but then when you throw on it the media or internet darling that is Lane Kiffin against Nick Saban, and then potentially the top two Heisman Trophy candidates between Bryce Young and Matt Corral, it does make for a pretty interesting day tomorrow in Tuscaloosa.
Well, Ole Miss has had some rough years preceding Lane Kiffin for the reasons you stated, but the Hugh Freeze era doesn't seem that long ago to me, and of course he beat Alabama a couple of times. Excitement for Ole Miss football, I think, at that point was greater than I've seen in my lifetime. How does this compare to those games a few years ago where Freeze beat Alabama a couple of times and Ole Miss really had it rolling in terms of buy-in and excitement from the fan base?
It's probably higher strictly because I think there's a part of the Ole Miss fan base that just believes in the ability of Kiffin to be able to win at a higher clip than maybe Freeze did year over year over year. So in some ways, it's more even than those years in 14 and 15. But it has a 2014 feel to it from the standpoint of it feels a little ahead of schedule in a way because, Ole Miss goes 5-5 in the regular or 5-5 overall last year in the pandemic year. They beat Indiana in the Outback Bowl, but their defense was 125th nationally last year. It was awful. So they've had to fix a lot of things. The defense is still not some steel curtain. It's not Georgia or anything. So it feels like from an overall depth, overall talent standpoint, Lane is working off a year ahead of schedule than where people expected. But that happens, A, when you have Matt Corral, and B, when free agency is basically here with the transfer portal and all these different rules for college football. The traditional rebuild is no longer what it once was. So fans are incredibly excited. They are, frankly, so excited they've turned into paranoid, nervous wrecks. If my message board and the internet is any sign, Chris, I mean, I think they're almost confident to a point of being scared to death of being confident this season.
How has Lane Kiffin turned it around so quickly?
Matt Corral. I mean, that's the easy answer, and it's not the complete answer. But when you have potentially the best quarterback in the country, because look, I mean, there's an alternate timeline here that is really scary for Ole Miss and frankly would change the scope of college football because Matt Corral is a redemption story that kind of gets overlooked unless you really go back into the minutia. We're talking about a guy that was cut from Florida and Southern Cal during the recruiting process. He was sort of known out of high school as just the guy that dated Brett Michaels' daughter and had a big arm. He ends up at Ole Miss. And at the end of 2018, he gets into a fight with Mississippi State on the field. It was, hey, he's got to get more mature. He's a loose cannon. Kind of played into all those stereotypes from high school a little bit. He gets into 19. He loses his job to John Rice Plumlee as Rich Rodriguez runs this option offense thing that they're doing with John Rice that season. And when Lane Kiffin was hired right before that, Matt Corral was considering transferring to Oregon. I mean, can you imagine the national landscape if he's the quarterback at Oregon today? Instead, he hangs out. One of the best things that happens to him and to Lane Kiffin and Jeff Levy is they all get in here as a team together, and they've become maybe the most dynamic offense in college football. Elijah Moore helped that so much last year, and this year Lane just finds weapons. I mean, you're talking about potentially the number one play caller in the country. He finds so many mismatches, so many ways to get his athletes out in space, and they're pretty talented on offense, and they've been pretty lucky with injuries on the offensive line. That's how he's turned this thing around. I mean, this thing is so offense-oriented, and then he got pretty fortunate with some transfers, which is what I was mentioning that accelerates this. Otis Reese came off a Georgia team. He's Ole Miss's the best defensive back. They got Jake Springer in, a transfer from Navy. They've got Orlando Amana at center, a transfer from Utah. They've really picked up pieces that seems like they've hit as far as being able to help in the SEC, and those little bit of depth advantages in getting some guys in has accelerated this process. Now, look, one sprained ankle and this thing can change quickly. I mean, they've got a lot of spots where they're just not deep at all, and they have to continue to be lucky. But just straight from an 11 or a 22 standpoint, as long as Corral's on the field, they have a chance.
You've seen some pretty good Ole Miss quarterbacks going back to Eli Manning. How does Matt Corral rate with the best they've had?
I think he's better than Chad Kelly. I'll go there at least to start, and that's a compliment because Chad Kelly's 2015 season, at least at the time, that was the third most total offensive yards in SEC history behind Johnny Manziel's 2 seasons at Texas A&M. He had more total offensive yards in 15 than Tebow did in his best year, than Cam Newton did in his best year, or anybody else. I don't know how to compare Corral and Eli because I'm not going to sit here and go, oh, Corral's better than a guy who was the number 1 overall pick and is potentially a Hall of Famer and has won 2 Super Bowls. But I will say that from a system combination of Kiffin and Corral and what they're able to do together, this is the best overall offense I've seen at Ole Miss in my lifetime. There's no doubt about that between the weapons and what he's able to do. And I do think Corral is going to be a very good NFL quarterback. I think he's going to end up being a top 10, top 12 pick before this thing's over. Some people would say I'm biased, but in a lot of ways, and you know this, Chris, when you cover a team, you see their warts too. You see maybe more negatives than the other players that you're watching around the country because you're not just watching highlight reels. But if I had to pick a quarterback in the country right now for the draft or just for this season, I'll take Corral over Spencer Rattler or Sam Howell or Bryce Young or whoever. I think that he has grown up. He's much smarter than he gets credit for. He's got the big arm. He's mobile enough with his feet. He's got a long career ahead of him, and he's as good as anybody I've seen.
I'm going to take a little sidebar on him. I hate the way we do the Heisman. First of all, you can't tell me that some years the defensive player hasn't been the best. I mean,
Sure.
What we do is we take mostly the elite teams and we pick the best offensive player off those teams, usually a quarterback or a running back. We've seen receivers a little bit too. But here's my point. Other than, I guess, in recent memory, Tim Tebow, the year he won it, I think Florida lost 3 or 4 games, and Tebow just put up such numbers that I guess he was the best option on the board. Ole Miss's issue or Matt Corral's issue is, I mean, they could be a great team. He could be the best player in the country. You could lose 3 or 4 games in the SEC, which is not an indictment on Ole Miss. It's just tells you what the competition is like. And to me, it wouldn't matter maybe how good Corral is in some years. That disqualifies you from the award more often than not. So I guess what I'm asking, he may be the best player in the country, which probably right now he is, but how realistic is it that he can win the Heisman given the way that award is voted on?
Well, you're speaking to potentially an Ole Miss crowd here since I'm on the show today. And I mean, they have a great example of that with Eli Manning. I mean, Ole Miss goes 10-3. They lose to LSU, they lose to Texas Tech, and they lose to Memphis. He was the number 1 overall pick, but he finished 3rd in the Heisman. They finished behind Jason White, and he finished behind Larry Fitzgerald there in New York, even with the name that he had. Matt, if you want to give hey, Ole Miss is not going to go on some magical season where they make the playoff or anything like that. And I mean, that's hard. You know, I'm not any way predicting that. It would have to look like Robert Griffin III's Heisman season. I think Baylor went 9-3 that year, and they just overwhelmed people with his stats and his numbers. He had big games even in losses. I think that's what it would have to look like because this is going to sound dumb, and this can be picked apart, and I probably wouldn't be able to argue with myself. If you're straight talking about the Heisman, I think Matt Corral losing in Tuscaloosa, but throwing up some huge day where you go, hey, that dude did all he can. He's incredible. Ole Miss just isn't good enough defensively yet. I think that gives him a better chance of winning the Heisman Trophy than actually winning the game. And I know that sounds crazy, but my point being, once you win, any loss the rest of the way looks like, oh, well, they didn't get it done. They folded. They lost to somebody worse than Alabama. And it sort of puts a damper on the end of the season. And you know how this works, Chris. The Heisman Trophy voting is in November, December. It's what you do in those games. You cannot win the game in September. Whereas if they lost and he looked great, and then Ole Miss ends up going 10-2, and he doesn't have the crazy 6-interception game like against Arkansas or something, I think he would have a shot at that Robert Griffin season where they go, dude, he was incredible. He can't help who his team was. They're still going to be in the Peach Bowl or the Cotton Bowl or whatever the other access bowls are that are not playoff games. and he should have a shot here. That's probably what it would have to do, but it also would mean he would have to be perfect and not throw up any statistical duds like last season. It's doable, but it's a fine tooth comb for Matt Corral to win the Heisman, and I think you're talking at least 10 regular season wins.
Yeah, I mean, that's another pet peeve. I have no idea why we award the best award before the teams have played the biggest games. I mean, and let's face it, you're Alabama or Georgia, you might get challenged 1 or 2 times a year, right? I mean, I have so many issues with the way they make that award, but I think you're right. But to your point, let's look at Florida. Florida got more respect as a team after taking Alabama to the wire than it did in its 3 wins that it got. So I think I can buy what you're selling there.
It's a little bit of a flimsy take, but I do think there's a point in it somewhere. And what's also benefited Corral is coming into the season, it was like, oh, this Heisman Trophy is going to be decided between Rattler and Sam Howell and whomever. Well, Rattler has looked very pedestrian. Oklahoma has looked very pedestrian, and then North Carolina's already lost 2 games. So those guys have been, at least as of today, which is October 1st, eliminated from the conversation. In some ways, for a preeminent favorite moving forward, it's a little bit of Bryce Young versus Corral on Saturday.
Well, I was going to say, if you could take one of those 2 quarterbacks versus the field right now, in other words, either Corral or Bryce Young wins the Heisman versus give me everybody else left, I think I might take those 2 on the field tomorrow to the field. What would you think on that?
Yeah, I do too, for a couple different reasons. One, as you said, somebody's going to jump out way up top, or they're both going to separate themselves from the field even more after Saturday. And then 2, Bryce Young, what bothers me a little about him, but it's also kind of a positive, is that he does not have the talent around him, at least as of today, or I shouldn't say talent, the production around him that Mac Jones had last year. I mean, Brian Robinson's been banged up. He's not Najee Harris. Mechie's pretty good, but he has not shown to the level of Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle and so many safety valves that Mac had last year, where Bryce Young, even as a freshman, is kind of having to do things himself a little bit. He's having to improvise. He's having to be a guy and be that dominant quarterback more than almost anybody in Saban's era, as far as the surrounding cast not picking him up and in some instances making him look better than he is. The other thing, though, from Alabama's standpoint, is you look at the SEC West, and it's not a bad division, but it's a division with a lot of parity and a lot of holes. Alabama may not get challenged much the rest of the way, which would allow him to, as you said, kind of skate through. You beat Ole Miss, you win the head-to-head with Corral, and you look pretty good from the Heisman, just because a lot of guys are going to even put their ballot in before they play Georgia in the SEC championship game.
Well, see, that's why the game Saturday intrigues me, Chase, because I watch them. And it's not the step on your neck Alabama team that we've seen in the past, but we've also seen them flip that switch, and then we go, what were we thinking there, right?
Well, it's what do you make of them? Because they beat Miami up in the opener, but Miami might just be a really bad football team. I mean, Manny Diaz might not, he might not survive the week now after losing to Virginia on Thursday night. Who knows whatever. I'm not putting anything into Mercer. And then with Florida, they're up 21-7, and you go, okay, is that the team they potentially are? Is that who they could be? But then they took their foot off the gas, and in the second half, not only could they put it back down, but their defense was on skates. Florida was running through them. Florida was dictating the tempo of that football game. And Alabama they're not getting home when they blitz at all. They're not as good in the middle of the field. They don't have the big run stuffer in the middle. They've struggled at linebacker outside of the Tennessee transfer Toto. They've really had a hard time filling some gaps into that defense where they're incredibly susceptible in the middle of the football field. They don't guard the running back out of the backfield very well. They don't guard the tight end very well to this point. There's some holes, and I feel like that's why there's so much nervousness in Tuscaloosa, is because what Ole Miss does well offensively is what Alabama has really struggled covering. And I think Bama's trying to decide, okay, do you drop 8 and let Matt Corral just pick you apart underneath and get down the field, and you try to keep them out of the end zone when they get close to the goal line? Or do we challenge, do something that, frankly, we haven't done well all season, but that's going to make us very susceptible down the field for Corral going over the top? I mean, they're in a little bit of a catch-22, at least based off what they've shown on defense so far this season.
Well, his snap count's not been that high so far, but everything you just said sounds like the recipe for a huge day for Jerry and Ely on Saturday.
It is. I expect because look, I think that we were kind of making this joke the other day. Ole Miss has played 3 games, and you've seen very little creativity on offense. They haven't needed it. They overwhelmed Louisville with just straight talent in the opener. Then they beat Austin Peay and they beat Tulane, who was just a tired football team trying to get back to New Orleans after their month in Birmingham. And you've seen very little of Ely. I mean, as you said, snap counts have been down. They haven't moved him around. They haven't done a lot of different creative things with him. It's been not only vanilla ice cream, but it's been like that generic store-bought ice cream for Lane Kiffin and Jeff Lebby on offense so far. I think you're going to see Ely in the slot. I think you're going to see him get out wide. I think he's going to play some Elijah Moore kind of stuff. And I tell you what they're also going to do is I think Dontario Drummond, who's been their best receiver, he's already in the slot, but I think they're going to bring him in even closer to the line of scrimmage. I'm not going to say he's going to put his hand down or anything, but I think you're almost going to see some tight end type stuff from Drummond a little bit where they really try to stress the middle of the field with Ely and Drummond and do some stuff because they're given the ability to do that because how good they are in the backfield outside of Ely. Snoop Connor is a banger in the middle, and then Henry Parrish is an up-and-coming running back that I think everybody will really know probably this time next year. So because of that depth, they can hand off the tailback duties, and they can let Ely just roam around the field, find some matchups, and find some areas in space to make things happen.
Well, we kind of skated around the edges of Alabama, but outside of Florida, and they didn't handle that one well late. We don't really know what they are because the competition hasn't been there. Miami hasn't been the team that I think a lot of people thought it would be. And look at Ole Miss, and you can sort of say the same thing. And again, that's not a slight to Ole Miss. It's just you're not going to tell anything from Austin Peay. Tulane, I love the way Tulane played Oklahoma early, but I think you're right. That situation has to take a toll. And then you've got Louisville, which is ordinary. That was a good win, and Ole Miss really just kind of cruised, and that one was over by halftime. So I think my question with Ole Miss is the same thing. I think this is a really good football team, but there does seem to be an element of we really don't know because of the schedule so far.
We don't know how good their defense is. We know it's better. That's for sure. They're 100% better on defense, and we think we know what the offense is capable of because Lane and Lebby have done such a good job of figuring out ways to score without Elijah Moore and without tight end Kenny Yeboah. And they haven't missed a beat. Corral's more mature. He's better with the ball. But on defense is going to dictate this thing because, like I said, they were 125th nationally out of 126 teams last year. They were also outside the top 100 in rushing, passing, overall scoring. You can't find a statistic where Ole Miss was in the top 100. Well, does better mean 85th? Does better mean 70th? Or does better mean 50th? Because if they're 50th, well, suddenly with that offense, Ole Miss might go 10-2. They might make a legitimate run here. They actually could beat Alabama and go for the West. But if it's just 85th or 80, well, they're probably going to not get many stops on Saturday. They're probably going to have some type of stress on offense at some point. And then you look up and Alabama wins the game, 55-42, and you go, okay, well, Ole Miss played pretty well, but they're not there yet. So to me, it's all about how good this defense is. The defensive backs are good. They picked up Chance Campbell from Maryland, a transfer linebacker who's been a game changer. Not just on making plays, but making sure getting everybody in the right place. So Ole Miss looks better coached, and I think Campbell has a part of that as well as DJ Durkin in his second season as defensive coordinator. But Ole Miss up front has still got some question marks. Sam Williams is their best edge rusher. He's got to be more consistent. He's been more consistent, but we're not in league play yet. It's just been 3 non-conference games. And then while there have been flashes, there's not that inside defensive line presence to stop the run that you can for sure count on. I like what Quentin Bivens has done a little bit. I think Katie Hill is better, but Ole Miss is running a 3-2-6 defensively. When you're running a 3-2-6, you need some defensive linemen to be pretty active to clog that thing up. So defensive line is what I really look at here on, are they good enough inside the SEC to really make a difference to make this where maybe it's a top 60 defense, 60, 65th. I think that's the baseline either way for this Ole Miss defense.
Chase, what's the story on Sam Williams? He was not a guy that was high on my radar coming into the year in terms of numbers, which can be deceiving. He's put up some good ones. He's had 4 sacks, a couple of forced fumbles, fumble recovery. I mean, for a team that lacked playmakers there a year ago, he's been that. What can you tell us about him and how effective you think he'll be tomorrow?
He is an NFL player if he is consistent, and if it's just from a talent standpoint, he's as good as Ole Miss has had on the edge in a really long time. However, He is your typical, and I mean, I'm not trying to be any certain way or not trying to profile, but a lot of JUCO guys, they have a hard time playing every down in the SEC and not having some inconsistency problems. He's been in some trouble off the field from time to time. There just been so many other things around Sam where he's not concentrated on football completely. He's not been all in on every single play. And, we saw flashes of an improvement because, look, if there's a time to do it, it's his contract year. It's right now, and this is what you make of your football life moving forward. He was coaching younger players during fall camp. We kind of looked over and went, yeah, we didn't see much of that from Sam in the past year or two. That's different. And to this point, it hasn't just been flashes. He's been very consistent. He's done everything right. And that might be just the godsend that Ole Miss needs on defense, because if he is that type of guy and he's putting forth that kind of effort, he really could be a close to double-digit sack kind of guy in the SEC. I mean, he can create some havoc off the edge, but you just never know what you're going to get, and it means that Durkin and those guys have to see enough consistently to trust him to play high snap counts and do what he needs to do.
What's your gut feeling on how the game Saturday unfolds?
I think it's a track meet. I mean, I saw that Barstool Sports on Thursday said it was the highest over-under total in SEC history. It's at 79.5 right now on total points. I don't know that I would go over or under, but just kind of laying out what you're talking about here with Ole Miss being the number one offense in the country and Alabama being number 4 to this point of the season. I think two things. Has Corral really matured, whereas he's not going to force a throw. What's this going to look like from his standpoint of protecting the football? Because any more than one turnover, and I don't see any way Ole Miss wins this football game. And then is Ole Miss's offensive line good enough to run the ball near the goal line? Because Ole Miss led the SEC in rushing last year, but they had a hard time getting straight power push down inside the 5. Well, if you're making Corral throw from inside the 5 for his scores, that thing's really congested. There's not a lot of places to throw, and you can be kicking field goals really quickly. Well, for Ole Miss, that's going to be empty possessions because Lane's not going to kick field goals inside the 5-yard line. He's going to go for it on 4th down. So can they run the football near the goal line, not get bogged down, maximize possessions, and then Corral's turnovers? Also, it's Corral's first game in a full stadium on the road since the very first game that he's ever started against Memphis in 2019. He played a little bit against Mississippi State in the last game in 2019, but he has not faced a lot of hostile environments. He hasn't been in a road crowd where he has to kind of settle down emotions. That's another thing early on that I kind of want to watch from him. Alabama saw that even a little bit. They had 6 pre-snap penalties against Florida, really dedicated to the crowd there in Gainesville and what they did to Alabama, because it's just new for everybody. We haven't had road games in a year, so there's something to get used to there. I picked Alabama to win a close game. I think that they just are a deeper team. Maybe they make 1 or 2 fewer mistakes. And look, it's been a little startling because you have a hard time finding people who think Alabama is going to cover this 14.5-point spread. But at the same time, you don't get rich betting against Alabama as a double-digit favorite at home. They win those games for a reason, and it's kind of like until the king loses his crown, I'm just going to stay with that. So I think Ole Miss plays with them. I think it's a 4-quarter game. I think I picked something like 48-41, something like that, Todd.
Yeah, you beat me to where I was going next. I think in a game like that, and I mean, really it's the case for most competitive games, turnovers are a big deal. I don't think either quarterback has turned it over all year. So do you have a gut feeling on whether one team has an edge there with being able to create or avoid those kind of mistakes tomorrow?
I would go with the home team having less chance of making the mistakes because I do want to see – I think Corral's going to handle it. I think that he has been looking forward to this. I think he's mature. I think he's done a little thing where he'll be great on the road. But I think the home team has a better chance of avoiding those. I think that Corral – it's the good and the bad. He's going to make some plays tomorrow just out of straight will. He's going to run the football and be like, wow, that's incredible. But he's got to know when he can do the incredible thing without doing the really dumb thing. And you're talking about split-second decisions in the middle of chaos. So I give Alabama maybe the edge there, and probably that's the edge that I think makes the difference. Now, look, I think Matt's the better quarterback. I think if you put out Matt Corral on the Alabama team and Bryce Young on the Ole Miss team, I'm picking Alabama to win this game by double-digit points. But in saying that, I just feel like Alabama being at home, they have a fewer chance. They have a less of a chance to make those critical mistakes as the game plays out through fourth quarters. Plus, they've been in a 4-quarter game. They got to experience kind of what that juice is like against Florida 2 weeks ago. Ole Miss hasn't done that this season. I mean, they've routed everybody they've played for the good or the bad of that. And, it's just it's kind of incredible. We were talking about that, teams take on the attitude of their coaching staffs. But Ole Miss hasn't felt like they're even taking on Lane's attitude. They felt like they're almost taking off Saban's attitude the last 2 weeks. It's been about, hey, win Tuesday, win Wednesday, win Thursday. And I know it's a lot of coach speak and talking points in press conferences, but there is a certain hyper focus about this group that I think it's almost a credit to Lane and how he's matured. He's been able to kind of put the carefree nature on his roster, but he's taken so many things from Saban and that storyline of Nick and trying to beat Saban for the first time of any assistant under him that he brought a ton of Saban with him to Oxford, and he's been trying to kind of make his roster feel almost a Saban robotic model as this season has played out.
Yeah, I got a chuckle out of something that your colleague Neil McCready wrote this week on the what was said, what he meant. It seems like Lane's tried to bring maybe a little rat poison into this one potentially.
He's trying to make Nick uncomfortable. I feel like everything he's saying, has been a little bit of gamesmanship, a little bit of this and that. I mean, he's spent the entire week basically going, "Hey, God, we're double-digit underdogs. We got no chance." I mean, he's making fun of everybody who picks Alabama to win, going, "Well, that took stones. That was a lot to that." I mean, he's having fun with it because we've been asking all of our guests on the podcast all week, of all the Saban assistants, which one would Nick like to lose to the most? And I think everybody said that he absolutely would like to beat Lane more than anybody else, simply because he knows Lane will talk about it forever if he wins the football game.
I don't know the birth order of the Kiffin kids, but he has to be little brother, right?
I don't even know that. I think so. I'm pretty sure. He definitely acts like it, doesn't it?
Right. No doubt about it. Like he is not, like, if you look at Lane Kiffin and said, who's the oldest child in the room, I don't think he's the guy that you would pick, right?
No, because, but here's the deal. While you're right, and I know, whatever, Lane is a complete introvert. When Ole Miss hired him, everybody said, "Oh, you're getting Spurrier." And you're getting Spurrier from the standpoint of Twitter and the fun and all of that kind of stuff. But Lane doesn't necessarily like being in huge crowds. Now, he can find it for recruiting. He can find it for fan engagement. But he's a guy who just kind of sits at home a lot, kind of plays on the computer. I mean, he is a complete and utter introvert who has found ways to maximize what he needs to do publicly for his job and just kind of almost have an alter ego on the internet. So he's a fascinating character on what he's actually like away from all that and what he feels like he needs to do to promote himself and his program and move everything in a positive direction.
Oh, look, it's been fascinating to watch from afar. I mean, this is a league where Alabama, other than LSU's little run 2 years ago, has just dominated the division, and we're dying for something interesting. And frankly, I'm glad we've got it with him in so many ways.
He has fixed his reputation outside of maybe what Michael Wilbon thinks more than anybody I've seen, because some of the reputation wasn't fair, A. And B, he's gone from being, he's the volatile coach or you never know what you're going to get, of kind of just being the most fun coach in college football, knowing you're going to get something that it's not life or death, it's not serious, but at the same time, he's showing up and he's managing his program and he's moving it in the right direction. He's a guy that I don't know how long he's in Oxford, but at the same time, I do think Oxford fits him a little better than people think. And I think that he has he's kind of changed on, there's probably still some wanderlust. I'm definitely not saying there aren't jobs he would take, and he might even take one after this year. I have no idea. But at the same time, I feel like he is kind of craving a certain level of stability as long as he is at a program where he feels like he can win at the highest level.
Oh, I think he'd be making a huge mistake if he left there. USC has come up. People have talked about that. But I just think that that's a place where water has sort of reached its level. And I don't mean that as an insult to anybody, but it's like it's a good fit. It's working. It's everything you said. He's an introvert. He's in a smaller town. He's kind of a hero right now. He's rehabbed his reputation. If I'm Lane Kiffin, I'm looking at this and I'm going, this is working, and I have no desire to leave.
Yeah, as long as, look, let's just keep it real. As long as he has the NIL booster involvement, things necessary to recruit to a level where he feels like he can win enough, I think he's in a pretty good spot there that he's allowed to, be himself. Oxford, even though it's small, is pretty good on leaving you alone publicly. Eli Manning lived here in the offseason for years, and unless a kid walked up to him in the grocery store, nobody messed with him. He can sort of fade in a little bit here more than he could in most places.
Couple more questions and I'll let you go. You live in a state that's just crazy, where you've got a rivalry between Ole Miss and Mississippi State that I think is underrated nationally. Those schools hate each other maybe as much as Alabama, Auburn. Some might say more. You've also got the Lane Kiffin factor, and then a few miles down the road, you got Mike Leach, who is big of a wild card as there is in coaching, too, in terms of what he might say. That rivalry's still pretty new. Where do you get the sense that one's headed between those guys? Because I think that in a lot of years, if both those teams are good and they're around, that could take that whole thing to a new level.
They get along personally, so you're not seeing the toxicity that maybe existed between Freeze and Mullen or all the stuff with the NCAA thing. I think it's a calmer rivalry. Frankly, if the trajectory stay as they are, and they may not, I mean, Ole Miss is in such a little bit of a higher place from an elevating standpoint that I think they can render less of the rivalry unless State sort of takes a jump here, because I'm not sure that the air raid and Mike Leach's offense can operate week in and week out in the SEC to make them competitive at that 8 or 9 win level in the league. I just don't. And I think, frankly, he recruits in a way that doesn't fit Mississippi State's brand and what they do well from a recruiting standpoint. So it feels like an odd fit to me. Frankly, I think the rivalry, I think that it is calmed. I think it's better. I think it's in a healthier place than it's been, but I think it's also in a very dangerous spot for Mississippi State right here, if I'm just being completely frank, because I think they're in a space where they've got some proof of concept that's not 100% there. And one more coaching change here that doesn't necessarily go well, that doesn't elevate them back into a Mullen level. If Kiffin did stay, I think you're in a weird spot if you're Mississippi State.
I feel like Ole Miss, everybody's got one eye on that situation and the other on Arch Manning. You don't see many football recruitments that are that high publicized that quickly. Of course, everybody knows the family ties and all those things. Where do you get a sense that he'll be heading in 2 years?
The eternal question. My gut tells me it still is Texas or Ole Miss, but if you told me he went to Georgia, I wouldn't be completely blown away. I don't give anybody else a ton of, I guess, helium right now. I think those are the top three. He will be in Tuscaloosa this weekend. He'll be in Oxford when they retire Eli's jersey against LSU later in October. It feels like Texas or Ole Miss, even though I don't know what Texas joining the league potentially does to that one way or the other. But I mean, it's a straight football decision. I mean, this is not about his parents or where anybody went or the fact that even his mom's family are Ole Miss fans. This is about what's best for Arch Manning. And I think that they have made great strides in getting to know Lane Kiffin. I think Ole Miss is in a better shape today than they were when this thing first started. But if you told me one of those three schools, I wouldn't even have elevated blood pressure. I would believe any of them as things move forward.
Chase, thanks for joining us today. You and Neil McCready are the best at covering Ole Miss. You're two of the best in the business just at covering a beat, period, frankly. You guys are blowing it out for this one. Tell folks what's around the corner at RebelGrove. A lot of people who are going to listen to this probably already subscribe, but for those who don't, tell them a bit about what you guys do.
Yeah, so rebelgrove.com, head there, message board community, as you know, with rivals.com, plenty of content. And then our sister thing is MPW Digital, our podcast network. You can search that on iTunes. You can search Rebel Grove on YouTube. And the big thing right now is our huge pregame show we do every single week. Yesterday we had multiple guests. It went over 3 hours of pregame for Ole Miss and Alabama, including about an hour 15 minutes with our football expert Pete DeWeese, who broke out the charts and the video and everything and showed you what Ole Miss and Alabama are going to try to do to each other this weekend from a schematic standpoint. It's really interesting stuff, and it shows me that I know nothing about football every week.
Yeah, I'm in that boat with you. Chase, you've been a terrific guest. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, he's Chase Parham. I'm Chris Lee, host of The 14. We'll see you again next week.